Good evening to our alumni and friends on the East Coast, and good afternoon to our West Coast attendees. I'm Kelly Page, class of 1987, and the Associate Vice President for Alumni Relations. I want to welcome you to the first of several conversations with President Callahan, hosted by members of the University Board of Regents. Today, we welcome Regent Anne Milne, class of 1979. The seed to Regent Milne's international career was planted while earning her degree in international studies through Pacific's Callahan College, where she was a student advisor and spent time studying abroad in India. Currently, Regent Milne lives in New York City and is the managing director of emerging markets for Bank of America Merrill Lynch. We also want to welcome President Callahan, who joined us this past July as the 26th president of the University of the Pacific. Prior to that, he served as the founding dean of the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University, and as the vice provost of the ASU downtown Phoenix campus and chief executive officer of Arizona PBS. Please join me in welcoming Regent Anne Milne, our host for today's conversation.
Kelly, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I would like to thank all of our guests here today. We wish we could do this in person. In fact, my re-engagement with Pacific after many years of living on the East Coast occurred when I actually had meetings just like this in person from former presidents of the university and people in the development office. So I'm very happy that you're here today. This is a very important time in the life of Pacific and in higher education in the US. And so, Chris, I really thank you for making yourself available to meet with us today and to answer some of our questions. What I would like to do is start out with a few questions for President Callahan, and after that, we will open it up for your questions for him as well. But Chris, it's actually only been 5 months since you've officially been president of University of the Pacific. What a year we've had. Who would have guessed when you were first offered this position? What I would like to do is just ask you to first tell us what were 2 or 3 of the main motivating factors that led you to accept the position as president of University of the Pacific.
Well, thanks so much, Anne, and thanks for doing this today. And thanks to everybody for joining us. We know you all have very busy schedules, and we're very, very appreciative, particularly of our Pacific Alumni Association, who are sponsoring this, and Kelly and Aaron Mettler and everybody else. So thanks so much. I will say one of the reasons that was so attractive for Gene and I about University of the Pacific is exactly what we're seeing today. So I've been here. Anne claims it's only been 5 months. I thought it was more like 5 years. But we'll take her word for it. But really, in a very short period of time, I feel like I've gotten to know so many of our alumni, in addition to our students, faculty, and staff, and that's because of the spirit of Pacific, and that I think is timeless. From what you experienced when you were here at University of the Pacific to today, it's a real sense of community. And when Gene and I were looking at sort of our next opportunities, that was probably the most attractive thing about Pacific. It was this warmth and this connectivity that really came through from the very first conversations we had with folks. And the fact that as I'm looking at our screen here, and I know many of the folks already in this brief period of time, I think speaks to that. And I would say also, Anne, Pacific had certainly the right, not just the right feel, the right culture for what we were looking for, but also the great history. This is, as everybody knows, Pacific is California's first chartered university. We have this fantastic history of innovation, which is so desperately needed today in higher education. All of that were just great attractions. And it's such a good university that I think has the potential not just to be even better, but to be great and to be really the best university of its kind in the entire country. And what I mean by of its kind, I mean sort of what we would call in higher education student-centric comprehensive universities of about this size. There are a number that are outstanding, who we compete with on a regular basis, I do believe in the next decade we have the ability to be the very best in that. So those are just some of the reasons that were so attractive to us and on why we came to Pacific.
Okay, thank you. So clearly there's a lot of challenges in higher education today. So when you joined Pacific, what did you think would be the challenges with this university? Obviously, you've had many conversations with the Board of Regents. We've talked about what we think the challenges are. And maybe what surprises did you find when you and Jean arrived, both positive and negative, or good and bad?
Sure, and I'll put COVID aside for now and just sort of talk about it in a sort of a pre-COVID and post-COVID environment.
Sure.
I think the challenges that we face at Pacific are no different than the challenges that higher education faces. It's a dramatically changing sector, and it's within a discipline that, in general, and I don't mean just Pacific, I mean in general in higher education, there's really an aversion to change. So those are two real conflicting values, right? When you have a sector, an industry that needs to change and change dramatically, and on the flip side, you have a place that in organizations, and again, not just Pacific, but universities in general, that are change averse. And when I mean change, I don't mean the mission and the principles and the values. Again, that's one of the reasons why we're here. And Pacific has a fantastic mission. We're here to serve the next generation of leaders and the whole student. And we've heard that phrase resonating throughout the history of Pacific, to serve the whole student, to develop as not just professionals, but as people and as great contributors to society. That mission has not changed. That mission should not change. What needs to change is how we operate. And I say we, I mean sort of across higher education. But I think we're uniquely positioned to lead the way here at Pacific. We just need to work faster. We need to act with more of a sense of urgency, and we do it, and we need to do it collectively together. And you see in higher education very much this sort of siloed approach, where everybody, each organization within the university is sort of doing their own thing. And we're much better, and we will be much better when we're working together, when we're working across units. And we've already made some great progress on that front. But I think those are probably the biggest challenges that we have. And again, I have a high degree of confidence we're going to be able to make great progress, because we've actually made some significant progress in what has been a relatively short period of time. And in terms of surprises, I'm not sure if we've come across anything good or bad that surprised us. Probably it was what we expected, but maybe more so. Maybe those challenges were even more, but more importantly, the positive attributes were even greater than we thought. The positive attributes of Pacific have been, and always will be, its people, the students, the faculty, the staff, and the alumni. And we knew, because of that culture, that was a great strength. We had no idea to what degree. And this is a remarkable place. And I will tell you, Anne, I think that COVID has amplified those positive values. And every day I am absolutely inspired by our entire community. When you see the learning that continues to go on despite all of the challenges that we're facing with COVID. And the challenges are substantial. That is not, our students are not using that as an excuse to stop their learning, to stop their hopes and dreams. They are working harder than ever. And I will tell you, our faculty have been unbelievably creative in trying to recreate these fantastic small learning environments that, of course, is the hallmark of a Pacific education. And our staff have done really been completely selfless and tireless in putting all that together in support of our faculty and students. And if you think, well, sure, and every university in the country is facing those obstacles, and everybody's reacting the same way, I am here to tell you that is not the case. That is not the case. What you're seeing at Pacific is absolutely not. You're not seeing that across the board. I would say it is the exception rather than the rule. And many universities around the country, they are they're a bit paralyzed. The students are not rising to that challenge. The faculty are not stepping up and using their creativity and their passions. And the same with the staff. You're simply not seeing this. Certainly, you're not seeing it to the degree you see at Pacific. And to me, that's all about the tradition and the culture of this place. So it really, in a lot of ways, Pacific has brought out, COVID has brought out the best of what it means to be a Pacific.
So let me just follow up on that. You were, I guess you were appointed as president prior to COVID being announced, but you sort of were in the transition phase up to the July 1st official start, with fully involved with the implementation. What were the biggest changes that you had to implement, and where are we now in terms of the process of managing coronavirus with the university students, faculty, staff, et cetera?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and it's, you know, it's hard to underestimate how much of an impact COVID has had. You know, what are we doing differently today than a year ago? The short answer is everything. So we have been, since basically mid-March, we have been almost exclusively in a remote environment where our faculty have had to completely transform their learning environments into remote learning. So that the core of what we do, the dissemination of knowledge, is completely changed, and it's changed as radically as anything can. Our research operations have changed, our service operations have changed. Everything has changed, you know, because of the constraints of COVID. Some of those, and just to put this in context, and you've heard me say this, and this is true. This is the greatest threat. COVID is the greatest threat to higher education in the 384-year history of U.S. universities and colleges. Period. It simply is, and you see that playing out across the country. Chronicle of Higher Education just had a story earlier this week where the overall full-time workforce in higher education in the United States today is 12% less today than it was in February. Think about that. I mean, that is dramatic. There are 556,000 fewer full-time jobs in higher ed today than there were in February. That's a dramatic impact. We certainly at Pacific have been impacted, I will say, to a much less, a much smaller degree than almost all of our peers and colleagues. And I can tell you just one sort of data point, Anne, which I think illustrates this. We were preparing, as all universities were preparing this summer, to have a massive enrollment decline. We were projecting a 20% enrollment decline. And as I suspect everybody on this call knows, our main revenue source is students. 90% of our revenue comes from students in the way of tuition fees, housing, dining, et cetera. We were projecting a 20% enrollment loss because of the work that our faculty did, because of the work our staff did, because of the leadership that our vice presidents and deans and Provost Pollicini showed, that our current enrollment is almost exactly what we had projected before COVID. And that is, I had not seen that at any private university in the country. In addition, our retention rates for students returning from their first year to their second year actually is up this year in the year of COVID. I don't know of anybody who's been able to approach that. And again, I attribute that to the great efforts of our faculty and staff. So dramatic changes. You will be hearing shortly. We're announcing to our community today that because of COVID in California, in particular, on all three of our campuses, which is now at the highest point in all three of our communities, that even the height of summer COVID rates, the governor has issued stay-at-home orders, as have the counties, that we are announcing today that we will start the spring semester in this continuing remote environment. On one hand, a very difficult decision because nobody wants to continue to be in a remote learning environment, but we think it's the right call. We think it's the safe call. And I will tell you, Anne, and you've heard me talk about this before, I tend to compare Pacific with my previous university, wonderful university that I'm very proud of, but they took a very different direction. And they largely opened back in Arizona for the fall semester. And they have last week went over the 3,000 mark of confirmed student COVID cases, over the 3,000 mark. And that, you know, there are financial problems and there are health problems, and neither are good, but I would take the financial problems every day.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that the information on enrollment was very impressive. I think we were all extremely pleased to see that. But now for a little bit more of the tougher questions. There's a lot of challenges with higher education, particularly for private universities like University of the Pacific, given its much higher cost, access, more particularly for private universities, difficult access for many potential students, the rise of online education. Maybe you could just outline for us what you think are the biggest challenges for Pacific going forward as a private university, and what steps are you thinking might be necessary to keep private universities like UOP relevant for future education?
Sure, Anne, I appreciate that. And again, it goes back to what I was referencing earlier, which were the great challenges that all of higher education faces. So, you know, sort of separate from COVID, these existed before, they will continue to exist afterwards, and we have to meet those challenges. They are significant. Part of them are demographics, that there are going to be fewer over the next 25 years, fewer college-age students entering colleges and universities. Now, we're fortunate in Northern California because this is literally the best place in terms of potential college students just based on demographics. So we're fortunate in that way. But what we have to do is we need to do two things at the same time. We need to increase our enrollment, and we need to find ways to cap tuitions. Tuition across the United States has gotten untenable for families. And I would say that's private and public schools. You know, public schools have a much lower sticker price, as they say, but not a dramatic difference in terms of the actual costs, because private universities like Pacific give so much in aid. You know, so while our tuition is $50,000 a year, which is just unbelievable, the average student is getting more than half of that back in various scholarships and the like. Nevertheless, we're getting to the point, right, where we really can't be raising tuition much more without completely locking out families who deserve to be in university. So the first thing we need to do, and I can talk about this in more detail if anybody would like, but we need to increase our enrollment. We have more capacity for more students. This is a great university, and without changing our standards one iota, we need to have more students on board, and we're starting that process already. The second thing is we need to find completely new revenue streams that are going to be steady, that are separate from that core operation of degree-seeking students, that is going to help support this very expensive enterprise of teaching young people. And as Anne knows, we had a wonderful meeting with the regents back in late October where we brainstormed a whole bunch of ideas. I will tell you one only because it's my next meeting. And that is the notion of creating a high-end seniors apartment complex for seniors on the campus where people can come and live in lovely luxury condos and have all of the amenities available that you would have at Pacific, going to classes, going to games, going to concerts, and all of that. A few universities have done that. We're having a conversation later this afternoon with a team from Stanford who's done this very successfully. That's one example, Anne, of the sorts of things that we want to be thinking about. It's not necessarily core to what we're doing and what our main mission is, but boy, if that can help some of our alums and have a fantastic place to live, and especially for the intellectually curious, as well as provide a steady revenue stream, that would be, I think, a win-win. Those are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about as we go forward, not just, okay, great, let's just raise tuition again this year, because that is not tenable in the long term.
Okay, thank you. Well, there's a lot more questions I could ask you, but I think one of our key objectives is to interact with the alumni that we have here on the call. So I'd like to open it up to Q&A, and I think that I'll pass it over to you now, Chris.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Anne. And I think, and are we a small enough group, Kelly, where we can just go ahead and unmute and fire away?
Sure, we could do that.
Kelly, you tell us. I don't want to.
Well,
I don't want to get us off track here.
the easier way is if you will raise your hand within the participants. If you go to the participant section, you can raise your hand and we can call on you. Does anybody have a question for either President Callahan or Regent Milne? Oh, it's a quiet group today.
And as we're waiting, Kelly, it's a good opportunity
Here
for
we
me
go.
just to say thank you to all of the alums who are on the call today, not only for making the time, but for your passion for Pacific. And one of the ways we've talked about what does the future look like? How do we make sure that the price of admission for students is kept at a manageable level? And you're doing that already, because so many of you are donating to the university, and that's absolutely critical. I'm very proud. Bernie Atterbury just told me earlier today that we're at 90% of our goal for our current capital campaign of $300 million, and that changes, those contributions change the lives of our students every day. Absolutely essential part of who we are and what we're doing. So I just wanted to thank all of you while I had the opportunity as a group. So
Great.
Sorry.
Okay, our first question is from alumnus Frank Young. So Frank, if you'll unmute yourself, which you've already done, and please ask your question.
All right. Well, thank you, Kelly. And hello, President Callahan. I think this may be the third meeting of this type I've been on, either with you or with your wife. And I'm glad, in one sense, I'm sad to hear about what's going to happen in the spring semester, but those of us who live in Florida, where we care a lot less about COVID, unfortunately, than they do in California, I will not judge how California is doing things, but I know it has to be a blow to a lot of students who wish that they could socialize on campus. You described in your remarks, you talked about Pacific's history of innovation, and something that I know you want to deepen. You're probably a good study on the history of Pacific by now, and you probably know that one of the biggest innovations in Pacific's history was the cluster colleges, started by President Burns in the 60s. I was a graduate, as was some of my colleagues on the call here, Jack Delman, Randy Boyer, Wendy Case, of Callison. I was Callison class of 72. Of all the cluster colleges, Callison is the only one with a successor institution, the School of International Studies. And I'm on Bill Herron's advisory board, and we get together every so often to kick around what's going on in the school. Maybe this is not so much a question, but hopefully an admonition and a hope that Pacific will find a way to continue the half century of innovation that it has had, is represented by Callison and represented by SIS in the field of international education and cross-cultural studies. It's a unique capability of Pacific's. I know it's an expensive department, it's an expensive school, but when you said that you wanted to do better working together across schools and departments, here's an area I think where SIS has a real contribution to make to all the schools, whether it's education, pharmacy, engineering, or the like. So I'm wondering if you have any reactions, thoughts, or comments to what I'm suggesting.
Well, Frank, first of all, I very much appreciate that. And you're absolutely right. Callison and Raymond and Cavell were, they were revolutionary And they, I think, while those schools and schools like that did not continue in the same form as they did when they were really prospering in the 1960s, early 1970s, the values and principles that they represented, if we're doing our job well, will be incorporated fully into our university. We'll use Callahan as an example. The fact of the matter, Frank, is the world today is much more global, is much more international, and the perfect example of that, than it was back in the 60s and 70s. So the need to have, and again, we'll use Callahan as the example, the need to have a broad, global, multicultural perspective, no matter what area you're going to go into, whether or not you want to be a pharmacist or a musician, or a historian or anything, is actually more important today than it was back then, because the world is, and I know it's a cliche, but the world is a smaller place, and having that sort of international sensibility is more important than ever. You won't be surprised to know, Frank, that I haven't been able to drill down too much on what Bill and his colleagues are doing. But I certainly agree and completely embrace what you're saying on the importance, particularly on an international front, and then how we can both support and infuse that across the university. And I think you hit on something that's absolutely essential. This should not be another silo. This should be something that permeates our entire university, on all 3 campuses and in all 10 of our colleges. So I think you're absolutely spot on. And we have the advantage of having that, of building on those histories and traditions that we already have with those colleges. And I love your shirt. So thank you, Frank.
Our next question is from Pat Kushlis, I believe, class of 1965 Raymond College. So Pat, can you unmute yourself and maybe you can pronounce your last name for us?
Sure, it's Kushlis.
Thank you.
Originally Lithuanian, but not me. Okay, this is the second time I've heard somebody in the past week mention the term, the problems with silos in universities. And I heard it first from the director of the Kissinger Institute at the Wilson Center, who is a Chinese specialist, and was speaking to a group of former and current Foreign Service officers, of which I am part of the former. And so this is kind of a follow-on to what Frank mentioned, but what we were told was that part of the problem that we're facing in regenerating the Foreign Service is the fact that the universities simply are not teaching the cultural, the multidisciplinary aspects of these different societies. And it's a real problem because if you want to understand China, which is the biggest threat out there, quote unquote, then you really have to know how to deal with it. And the way you do it is both at the university level and then also at the in the Foreign Service itself. So that's one thing. But the other thing, and I just wanted to kind of reinforce what's being said here. The other thing is part of a small group of Raymond alumni who put together a proposal for an interdisciplinary honors program. And I was wondering if you had a chance to take a look at it.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Pat. And I know I am close to one of your colleagues, and I know you guys have been working furiously on that. And I'll be completely honest with you, I have given it a look, but not a deep look. I have, as Ashley will tell you, I have my holiday file, and that is papers that I have not had a chance to give the time that it deserves to do a deep dive on, and that is near the top of my holiday file to get through. And I hope it doesn't sound like I'm making excuses, Pat, but I will say it has been an oddly busy time. So, and that does not mean we shouldn't be focusing on the future and strategy, and we are, and we will continue to. But that something like that really requires, quite frankly, more prolonged thinking time than I was able to get it to give it in the last few months. But it is on my on the top of my holiday file.
Just to conclude, I'm sure if you have any questions or would like to get in touch with Gary or any of the rest of us, please feel free.
Well, thanks, Pat. I appreciate it, and I'm just so appreciative of the effort that you all have put in. And again, quite frankly, it comes back to what I was speaking of at the open here, which is that Pacific spirit. There must be a lot of colleges who would have who would take that time to for alums to gather up and to put their thoughts together to help come out with a plan for the future. And I can tell you that's not the case. That's very unusual. Gary Grossman, who of course was a colleague at back at Arizona State, he has been a fantastic advocate for the Raymond concept, for the honors program concept that you guys are working on, and I'm just so appreciative of you taking the time and using your collective intellectual capital to help us think this through. I can tell you, Pat, the one thing that I know is here are the students. So I had the opportunity last week for their final class. I was the guest speaker for the honors seminar that we had, and it was a large class. We of course had to do it in the Zoom environment. I can't tell you the fantastic energy that you felt in that space, even in this environment, even through a computerized Zoom environment. These students are smart, they're passionate, they're thoughtful, and they are hungry for deep learning. So, and to me, that's the key ingredient to start off on what a new honors experience will look like, which is you have the student. And I can assure you, we have the student.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.
Our next question is from Dave Fredrickson, and he's a Pacific Alumni Association board member.
Dave, have you unmuted?
Yes, I have.
The most famous phrase of 2020.
That's right.
Dave, thanks so much for joining. And I just want to tell everybody, Dave Fredrickson has been such a fantastic supporter for Gene and me from literally day one, and I'm just very appreciative of that. And it's always good to see Dave. So thanks for joining, Dave.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be a part of it. And I think that one of the things following along the lines of what Frank and Pat were talking about, I think when you think about the revenue streams and the possibility of profit centers and other ways of increasing Pacific's financial strength, the work that you did with communications at Arizona is a good example of what I think could potentially happen here in the Central Valley. I mean, we are sort of media starved because we've not had, since KUOP left our campus, we have not had a strong media presence. And one of the challenges of Pacific for years has been that we sort of fall outside of anybody's media market. And so we get covered sporadically by Sacramento or by, even some of the Bay Area stations occasionally come over. But it seems to me like that the idea of some kind of a partnership between the university and a strong media partner would be a good thing. And of course, having taught in the communication department for a decade, I found that we're sort of in a backwater here with regard to the communication revolution. Our department lacks a journalism emphasis. It doesn't have really a strong news orientation, and the Media X is an interesting approach, but nobody seems to be quite certain what the objective of it is. And it just seems to me like, with your experience and your knowledge and the contacts that you bring, that we could certainly have an opportunity to build the communications presence of Pacific on the West Coast.
Well, I appreciate that, Dave, and you and I should actually sort of talk more about it, because I'd like to get more of your thoughts on this. I think you're right. Now, of course, we don't have a large communications school to to build upon, so I don't think we necessarily want to replicate what we did at Arizona State,
No,
but to build partnerships. I think, and that's really what Dave's talking about. I think is a brilliant idea. I can tell you, I'll just tell you two things really quickly. One is, when I was at ASU, and Dave knows this, I was able to bring the PBS NewsHour, which wanted to start a West Coast presence, to the school. So if you ever watch the NewsHour in the evening, you will see a little tagline saying, coming from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. And our students get the students at Cronkite have a chance to participate in that programming and learn while they're doing, which of course is such an important part of the Pacific education. Could we do the same thing with other news organizations? I think we can. And I'll tell you, Dave, very early on, I tossed out this idea to our friends at Capital Public Radio of whether or not we want to have a little bureau right here on campus, which wouldn't cost us much of anything. It's just a room or two. But to have that connectivity, I think you're right, because there are so many important, interesting, and powerful stories right here at University of the Pacific, and we just need more partners to help tell those stories.
Here's a little secret. As a part of the deal with KUOP, we're supposed to have a bureau on campus, and there's space in the communication department for that purpose, but it was never followed through on.
Yeah, I saw that space, and it's perfectly adequate, Dave, and especially these days in media, as you know, the cost of the technology is actually going down, not going up. So I think it's just a question of sort of a cultural fit. And this reminds me, I will come back to this, because I think I do think you're onto something.
If I may just interject very quickly, Dave and Chris, I don't think I'm saying anything sort of out of line, but when we went through the selection process for the new president of University of the Pacific, one of the factors, and of course there's many factors, why the board selected Chris was his background in communications and the recognition that we do need a lot more attention, publicity, in the community in California, in Northern California, in the Stockton area, and throughout the country as well. So that was one of our considerations as well.
Thank you, Ann. And if I could just riff off of that for a second, one of the things that I'm trying to do is promote the university on all sorts of different channels. So I've opened up some social media channels to help tell the Pacific story. And I think, Kelly, we can put that in the chat. Is that right? So the Facebook address and Twitter and LinkedIn, for anybody who's interested, I'm trying to post regularly. Of course, the university has its own social channels, but this is me actually trying to help tell that story in a more regularized way. So for anybody who's interested in following and having these continuing conversations in a social environment, please sign up for those social channels.
There is a brand new webpage for the university as well, isn't that correct?
That's right, Ann, and that goes to this notion of, I mentioned before, we need some more students. Students today, find out about universities in digital ways. through digital and social. And we do have a new website that is completely geared towards prospective students. As I told some of my colleagues here, if you don't like it, that's probably a good thing, because we're not the audience. 17 and 18-year-olds are the audience, and their families. We've gotten some great feedback already. And when you have a chance, and maybe I'll ask Kelly to put this out also on the chat, we have a fantastic new, very short 3-minute video that I think really captures the answer to the question, why should you come to University of the Pacific? And in 3 minutes, I think it does a really good job of telling that story. So Kelly, if we have the opportunity, maybe we can post that also. I thought it came out really well.
Yes, we'll do that. Our next question is from Gary Grossman. I believe he is also a Raymond graduate. Gary, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, it's Cluster College Day from the 60s. How you doing, President Callahan?
Gary, thanks so much for joining.
Listen, you identified enrollment growth as a very important piece of your future. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is, what is Pacific's value proposition today? And then going on and into the future that you're envisioning, what needs to change? What needs to be added at Pacific to bring it to the market position that you believe it should have?
Yeah, Gary, I honestly think it's almost exclusively a messaging challenge. I think there's plenty of things that we can do, new programs we can add, and we will, current programs that we have that we can do better. All of those things are true. But at the end of the day, what's missing is our ability to tell our story, because our story is very powerful. And in a nutshell, I would describe it simply as this. And I look at it from the parent point of view as much as the prospective student, which is very often parents are left with two choices. You can go to, if you want that small, intimate learning environment, you go to a small liberal arts college. There are many of them. Many of them are outstanding. The Occidentals and Pomonas of the world, fantastic experiences, but they're very small, and you have very limited choices. You don't have professional schools typically. You have limited majors, very, very limited choice, but fantastic learning that goes on there. On the flip side, you have the big universities. You have UCLA, you have ASU, Berkeley, and all the others, which are fantastic, have unbelievable choices, but they're large institutions. You do not get that personalized learning that you would get at the small liberal arts college. The difference, what Pacific provides, is both. And there are precious few universities in the country where you could have those learning environments of that small liberal arts college. Small classes, one-on-one, truly caring professors who are there for the students. And at the same time, a myriad of choices and more than 100 different majors and specializations in 10 colleges across 3 campuses. That combination is very rare. I think that combination is unbelievably attractive to students and their parents if we can get that story out. Oh, and by the way, you're doing it all in Northern California.
Yeah.
Literally no better place to do it. So I think, Gary, and that's not to say that, all of our programs are perfect and we're just going to keep everything the way it is. Not at all. We're going to improve all of our programs. We're going to add new programs. But at the core, to me, the biggest obstacle is we need to tell that story, tell it in powerful ways on all different platforms all the time.
Gotcha. Thank you.
No, thank you, Gary.
We've added 2 links in the chat to the website, which is the www.pacific.edu. And then also the video that President Callahan was talking about is at pacific.edu/choice. So we suggest you watch it. It's great. Next up for a question is former Regent and Board of Regents Chair, Diane Filibosian.
Chris.
Hi, Diane. How are you?
And my husband, Saif, is here with us too. Nice to see you.
Good to see. I don't see anybody, so I'm just going to assume that you're there.
Oh, okay. We're both here. We're both
Thank you,
here. We're both big fans and are really excited about the transformational work that you'll be doing at Pacific over the next few years. I want to acknowledge our wonderful, legendary Art Dugoni, and how we all miss him, and we'll celebrate his life with the memorial on Saturday, but also to recognize that what he talked about at the Degoni School of Dentistry was growing people, and along the way they become dentists. And I think that the whole of the university has moved towards embracing that even more and more, especially with many of the initiatives in the humanities that have been going on. And this isn't a question, but a congratulations to you, to the whole of the university, on establishing the Dr. Lawrence Meredith Endowed Chair in the Humanities. Because for many of us, he was a transformational figure in our lives as students, and the work that he's done that will inspire future generations of students is really heartwarming. So thank you so much for establishing that chair.
No, well, thank you, Diane, for those unbelievably kind comments. Diane has been, and Tom have been fantastic supporters and great folks that I use for advice as we move forward. If I could just amplify on that, because I think the chair in honor of Larry speaks to Pacific. First of all, speaks to the importance of the humanities, and Anne does not want me to ramble on about this because she's heard this way too much. But I firmly believe that a liberal education, particularly in the humanities, is not just important today, but you could argue more important than it was in the past, because so many of the things that you learn in a broad-based liberal arts education are what is really most in demand in the market today, where you learn how to think critically and how to find information, and how to analyze it and synthesize it and distribute it and communicate it written in a written form and verbal form, and how to think globally. All of those things are what you learn in a great humanities and a great liberal education. So I think, and again, I think it comes back to not changing that, but how do we tell that story better? Because we don't do a good job of telling that story. I don't think any university, quite frankly, does. And I think there are great opportunities there. But the Meredith Professorship, I think, is particularly important to note, because again, it comes back to that Pacific spirit, where the support for that came from his former students, because he had such an impact on their lives, such a direct impact that they not just remember, but they still refer to and rely on decades later. That's what Pacific is about. That's the Pacific experience. And that is, I won't say it's unique to University of the Pacific, but it is, we're among a very, very, very few number of institutions around the country that have that sort of connectivity between students and faculty. That is the power of a Pacific education.
And that's what will truly carry it into the future. And I think that's a lot of what unites alumni from all different eras and all different decades, is that we have all shared the experience of that close faculty-student relationship and that Pacific education. And so thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Diane. Thank you for all that you've done and continue to do for the university. For those of you who don't know, Diane was a great regent for us for many years. And as Anne will tell you, that is an enormous amount of work. And the university literally cannot function without the leadership of our region. So thank you, Diane.
Looks like we also have former Regent Steve Glart on the line.
Hi, Steve.
Oh.
Kelly, I'm not hearing anybody. I'm not sure if I'm the one who's got knocked out or.
No, I don't hear anything.
Yeah, I thought it was just me. Steve, we can't hear you. maybe your audio isn't plugged in? Or do you have a headset that maybe you typically use and it's
Can you hear me now?
We
awesome?
can.
Yes.
Thank
Steve?
you.
Okay. Well, it was such a great question. Now I can't remember it. Let's see. No. Anyway, sorry about that. Technical difficulties. Zoom's not an allowed media here yet, so we don't have it working properly. Anyway, it's really unfortunately it's not a cluster quality question. It's really about your experiences, Chris, since coming. I'm sure you had a great plan ready to go. And then of course the world changed. So how have you had to pivot and reprioritize? And do you have concerns that something's gotten lost because of the changes in the environment that we're in?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, Steve, and it's good to hear from you. Certainly, it's a completely different plan. I will say that I had my transition plan that I had designed back a year ago. It was lovely, and it was very nicely paced, shall we say, going out, meeting people, traveling across the country, meeting our alums, et cetera. Obviously, none of that has been able to come to fruition. But with COVID, and I hope this doesn't sound crass, because I don't mean it to, but actually there have been a lot of opportunities to accelerate a lot of the things that I think we needed to do in this environment. The decision-making has naturally become much faster. Now it has to be to a large degree, but I think that's going to have a positive residual impact going forward. Use of technologies, because of the situation we're in, we had to accelerate that. That's actually been a great benefit. So certainly I spent the first 5 months more tactically than I would have anticipated because of COVID, because we were facing some pretty serious short-term threats to us, as all universities were. So I probably spent more time in the short term than I ever would have imagined, but I think that was time well spent. I think I've learned about the university in a much more accelerated way than I would have under other circumstances. And we've been able to move the ball forward, I think, in a number of different ways, much more rapidly than we would have, ordinarily. So not that we would have wished COVID ever on us, but I think our reaction to it has actually had some positive impacts in the short term, and I think it will in the long term also. I'll tell you, Steve, one of the things we have not had a chance to do, and obviously, COVID prevents us from doing much in terms of learning our communities and going around. But when things open up again, Gene and I have promised ourselves that we're going to take a walk down Pacific and have an ice cream cone at Baskin Robbins in your honor and Christy's honor. So we're looking forward to that.
Hey, Christy had chocolate peanut butter and I had pralines and cream.
We're all in on it.
We're going to take one more question and then I'm going to throw it back to Anne. So Alan Hardcastle, and he also is a Pacific Alumni Association board member. Alan?
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chris. Thanks for joining us again, and I'm going to turn the tables on you, and that is, I know at the end of every session you ask this question. In one sentence, can you sum up what your purpose is?
Thanks, Alan, and I do appreciate you joining. I appreciate all of your support. That's simple. My purpose is to make University of the Pacific the best university of its kind, the best student-centric, comprehensive university in the United States by the end of the next decade. And Alan, nobody's asked me that, so thank you for doing that. And I was, as Alan knows, that's one of the things that we always like to ask our guests, and nobody's asked me that. You were the first one, so thank you for doing that.
Okay, Well, that was actually would have been a great one to end on, but I am going to end with one final one since we do have a number of alum on the call today. But we've talked about a number of the initiatives that you're looking for going forward. What other initiatives could you just sort of finalize and tell our great audience here today that you're looking to maybe address in terms of student composition, alumni participation, increased awareness of the university across the country? And maybe what could the audience here today do to help in meeting some of these objectives?
Well, thanks, Ann. And I'll try to answer all of that in one area, and that is rankings. So college rankings, very controversial. I will preface it by saying I hate all college rankings, but the fact is they are an important part of our success, particularly the U.S. News and World Report rankings. Now, many universities, not many, but some universities have gotten to the point where they disagree with the methodology so much that they simply say, we're going to ignore it. We're not going to pay any attention to our U.S. News and World Report rankings. And that's a fair conclusion. There's nothing wrong with that other than the fact that actually you really need to believe then that the rankings don't matter. And I firmly believe they do. When Don DeRosa was president, and I'll tell you, Don is very generous with his time when I call him on a regular basis for his advice on a variety of Pacific matters. Don and his team really focused on the U.S. News rankings, and the result was we got into the top 100 of U.S. national universities. So that's the group that includes, Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, et cetera. And we're not there anymore, and it's nobody's fault, certainly, but it goes to just a lack of prioritization. I think it's important, so we're going to focus on it. And while I don't agree with all the methodology, some of it is actually really, really important, such as key student success measures like graduation rates. Our graduation rates are nowhere near where they should be. Part of that is mechanical problems. Part of that is cultural. So we're really internally, we're going to take that on. U.S. News measures a variety of variables. The two that we perform on the worst, quite frankly, is graduation rates, which we already have a team in place with the deans to start addressing that. And the other is alumni giving. And U.S. News does not rank alumni giving by dollars, but by simply the percent of participation. And ours is the lowest by far of all of our peers across the country. So this is not an ask to, please, please everybody send their 7-figure gifts to us, before the new year. But if you wanted to do that, of course, that's great. But more importantly, actually having many more alums participating in the annual giving process that Kelly and her team are involved with, because we need to get those percentages up. Because that is hurting us as much as our graduation rates. And there are some things that I can't fix directly, and that's one of them. I will tell you that our aspirational schools have about 20+% of their alums giving on an annual basis. Our peers are about 10 to 12%. We're below 5% of our overall alums. And that is just so counterintuitive to what I see and hear and feel when I talk to alums like you around the country, because there's such passion for the university. So I guess, Ann, I would roll all of those elements into sort of U.S. News rankings and how do we focus on those. I will tell you my goals, much like Don's from a number of years ago, was to get us back into the top 100. And then after that, to get us to the point where again, we are outpacing all of our similarly sized competitors. So I think of that as a two-step process.
Okay, thank you. That's very inspiring, I think. And I'm very excited to be part of the team that will help lead us in that direction. Thank you very much for your time, Chris. I'm going to pass it back to Kelly now.
I'll just say thank you so very much to all of our alumni and friends who joined us today. We are going to continue this conversation with in the future, starting back in January. So watch for a posting on this. and you will get to meet other regents, just like Regent Milne joining us with President Callahan. So thank you again, both to Regent Milne and President Callahan.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks, Anne, for leading us, and thanks to everybody for joining.
Thank you. Thanks. Have a great evening, everyone.
Be well.